You know that feeling, right? You see something in the news, maybe just an image, and bang, your mind jumps straight to ancient Rome.
Yeah, it happens all the time. For centuries, people have made that connection, comparing their own time, their own nations, to the Romans.
But what if it's, like, more than just a coincidence? What if the America-Rome comparison is deeper, almost baked into how we think?
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got this great stack of sources, but we're really centering on Cullen Murphy's book, Are We Rome? The Fall of an Empire and the Fate of America.
Right. And our mission really is to unpack those similarities. Some are pretty striking, maybe even a bit unsettling. We want to look at what Rome's fall actually was.
Because it's not what most people think.
Exactly. And see what lessons, if any, might be hiding in there for how you understand America now and, maybe where it's headed.
Think of this as your guide to a comparison that pops up everywhere in our national conversation, sometimes loudly, sometimes just humming in the background.
Yeah, we'll cut through the noise, pull out the key stuff, maybe spark a few aha moments for you. So let's get into it. Are we just seeing the American eagle in Rome's mirror?
Well, if you start looking, the echoes are loud right from the beginning. The founding fathers.
Oh, yeah, they were obsessed.
Totally obsessed. They weren't just glancing at Rome, they were deep into it. They looked to the Roman Republic, pre-empire, for their political models, checks and balances, that whole idea.
They came straight from trying not to repeat Rome's slide into autocracy.
Precisely. And they were really captivated by this Roman idea of virtus.
Which isn't just virtue like we might think of it today, right?
No, it's much more about public duty, civic excellence, courage, leadership, doing what's right for the Republic, not just for yourself.
And Washington was the poster boy for this.
He really was. He was seen as America's Cincinnatus. You know the story, the Roman farmer leaves his plow, becomes dictator to save the state, then just goes back to his farm.
Gives up the power. It's a powerful image.
Hugely. And it wasn't just symbolic. At Valley Forge, in the middle of the war, Washington actually had Addison's play Cato performed for the troops.
Cato? Why that play?
It's all about Roman Republican virtue, liberty, standing against tyranny. He was literally trying to inspire his soldiers with these Roman ideals.
And this Roman influence, it's not just in ideas or history books. It's like physically built into Washington, D.C.
Oh, absolutely. You walk around D.C., you feel that grandeur. The Jefferson Memorial, it's basically a mini pantheon.
Okay, I can see that.
And Union Station draws heavily from the baths of Diocletian. Even the Washington Monument, that obelisk form that's echoing the obelisks the Romans took from Egypt.
Wow, so they were consciously trying to evoke Rome.
It seems undeniable. And maybe that deep connection, sort of woven into the capital itself, helps explain why comparing the U.S. president to a Roman emperor or America to the Roman Empire.
It just feels so familiar now. It comes up almost automatically.
It really does. It's like this default lens we use. And naturally, using that lens leads to very different, sometimes conflicting takes on America's role in the world.
Okay, so if the comparison is that baked in, how do people use it? What are the main camps?
Well, you definitely have the declinists. They're the ones who look at Rome's fate and worry about imperial overstretch.
Meaning we're doing too much globally, spending too much, stretching our resources too thin.
Exactly. And they also point to things like growing executive power, secrecy, surveillance, things they see as undermining the Republic, maybe like happened in Rome.
Okay, so that's one view. Worry about decline. Who's on the other side?
Then you get the triumphalists. Think of historians like Neil Ferguson. Their argument is basically that the world needs a dominant power, a sort of liberal empire, to keep order.
And the U.S. is the only candidate for the job.
That's the idea. They see America's global role not as overstretch, but as a necessary, maybe even beneficial burden, performing global imperial chores, as the source puts it.
Interesting. Then there's a religious angle, too, isn't there?
Yes, and it's quite fascinating. You had figures like Reverend Jerry Falwell, who explicitly linked Pax Americana, American peace and power, with the spread of evangelical Christianity.
That sounds very much like how some Romans viewed the expansion of their empire and their state religion.
It's a striking parallel to some 4th century Roman thinking about church and state being intertwined. And, it wasn't just rhetoric. Vice President Dick Cheney's Christmas card in 2003 reportedly had a, quote, linking American power, even its military actions, directly to God's plan.
Wow. Okay.
And then sort of pushing things even further, you have the expansionists.
Like that wild idea from Regis Debray.
Ah, yes, the United States of the West. His proposal was essentially to extend American citizenship to, well, huge parts of the developed world: Canada, Mexico, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand.
He called it a new Edict of Caracalla. What was the original?
The Edict of Caracalla was in 212 AD. The Roman Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to basically all free men living within the empire's borders. It was a massive deal. Changed who was Roman, expanded the tax base, but maybe diluted the meaning of citizenship too.
So Debray was suggesting a modern, even grander version of that integration under American leadership.
Pretty much. It sounds extreme, maybe, but it shows how potent that Roman model of expansion and assimilation still is in some minds.
Okay, so moving beyond the big ideas and the imperial visions, there are these really practical, on-the-ground challenges that both Rome and America seem to share, like military manpower.
Yeah, this one's huge. Rome constantly struggled with having enough soldiers. Eventually, they relied heavily on recruiting non-Romans, people they called barbarians.
Like the Batavians, the Tungrians, even Alaric, the Visigoth who sacked Rome.
Right. And the irony is, Alaric was a Roman general. He'd served Rome for years, but felt he wasn't getting the respect or advancement he deserved. His sacking of Rome wasn't just an outside attack, it was partly an inside job, born of frustration within the system.
And America faces its own manpower issues today.
Absolutely. You see proposals like Max Booth's Freedom Legion offers citizenship in return for military service, modeled on the French Foreign Legion.
It highlights a real recruitment challenge.
It does. And Boot even asked, starkly, what's the alternative? $100,000 signing bonuses, recruiting felons. It shows the pressure.
And this manpower issue feeds into something else the sources mentioned, this two cultures problem.
Yes, the growing gap between the military and the civilian population. When you had a universal draft, more people had a connection to the military or knew someone who served.
But with an all-volunteer force.
That connection phrase. The source uses this stark example. Princeton graduates in the military in 1956, around 450. By 2004, just 8.
8. That's a massive drop.
It really is, and it raises questions, When fewer civilians have direct experience with the military, how does that affect public understanding, support, and even decisions about war?
Which leads right into another big theme, the privatization of power.
Exactly. It's not just about who fights, but how war is fought. The Iraq War is described as the most privatized major conflict since the Renaissance.
Billions going to private contractors.
Tens of billions. You have companies like MPRI, DynCorp. They're not just support staff. They can deploy forces, build bases, train other armies. It's a massive outsourcing of core military functions.
It makes that line from Catch-22 seem less funny and more unsettlingly real. Milo Minderbinder saying the government should get out of war and leave it to private industry.
It really does stick with you, doesn't it? Because we've moved significantly in that direction.
And this privatization isn't just happening in the military.
Not at all. That's another key parallel. In Rome, part of the decline involved the weakening connection between the emperor's decisions in Rome and what actually happened on the ground in the provinces. Bureaucracy got tangled, implementation failed.
And in the U.S., we're seeing a massive privatization binge across the board.
It seems like it. Prisons, schools with voucher programs, nuclear waste handling, meat inspection, port security, even public data collection by the Census Bureau is being outsourced or sold off.
The source calls it a leaching of management capacity from government.
Which is a great phrase. It suggests a hollowing out of the government's ability to actually do things directly, which has long-term consequences for oversight and accountability.
You can even track this shift in the meaning of words.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Like suffragium. In Latin, it first meant a vote, a ballot. Later, it came to mean basically political influence, patronage pressure.
And franchise.
Originally from Old French meaning free, it was about political liberty. Now, we mostly think of a commercial right, like a McDonald's franchise.
Those little shifts tell a big story about what we value.
They really do. And if you look at Washington, D.C. today, it functions very much like an imperial capital.
Oh, so?
Well, it's statistically richer, more educated, more professionalized than the rest of the country. The source even notes how political talk shows use these like imperial trumpet flourishes in their theme music.
Huh. I think I know what you mean.
And offer this luxury skybox view of politics, which can feel pretty detached from the lives of ordinary people.
And this concentration of power, especially in the executive, the fact we haven't had a formal declaration of war since World War II, despite numerous major conflicts.
That's a huge indicator. 14 major combat operations initiated largely by the executive branch. It shows a decisive shift in power away from Congress, much like power concentrated in Rome over time.
Okay, let's shift to borders and outsiders. Another area with really strong echoes, the Roman view of non-Romans. It was complicated.
Very often dismissive, seeing outsiders as unfathomable, certainly inferior. There's that quote from the physician Galen.
Oh, the one about Germans.
Yeah. I am no more writing for Germans than for wolves and bears. Pretty harsh. And that kind of attitude isn't unique to Rome, it's common in empires.
But at the same time,
At the same time, Rome was incredibly successful at integrating people over the long haul, probably the most successful multi-ethnic state in history, absorbing Gauls, Greeks, Syrians, Africans.
so a real paradox there.
Yeah.
Dismissal and assimilation side by side.
Exactly. And America has its own version of this complex relationship with the outside world. The source talks about a kind of sameness delusion.
Meaning, we assume everyone else is or wants to be just like us, or we just don't pay much attention.
Kind of a mix of both. And indifference, maybe. Think about how Betty Crocker had to update its composite image to actually reflect the changing demographics of America itself. Or Richard Florida's idea of the spiky world.
Right, where global elites in cities like New York, London, Tokyo connect easily with each other.
While potentially being quite disconnected from the millions of locals in their own countries who aren't part of that global flow.
And looking at physical borders, Roman frontiers like Hadrian's Wall, they weren't just solid walls, were they?
No, not at all. We think of them as barriers, but they were more like zones of interaction, regulating trade and movement. People and goods crossed back and forth constantly. They were permeable membranes.
Which sounds a lot like the U.S.-Mexico border.
It's a very similar dynamic. You have this huge wealth disparity, creating this constant push and pull. Cities like Juarez are deeply intertwined with the U.S. economy, providing labor and markets. It's an intensely active, complex zone, not just a line on a map.
The demographics in border states like California, Arizona, Texas, they really do start to resemble those Roman frontier provinces with their mix of cultures.
Absolutely. And the source points out this incredible irony.
Using expensive private security firms.
To keep out low-wage workers who are being pulled in by the demands of our own economy, it's a cycle fueled by our own needs.
And as a specific modern example of this imperial dynamic, the Green Zone in Iraq seems really telling.
Oh, definitely. A powerful symbol of isolation. The American administrator there was commonly called the proconsul.
Directly borrowing the term for a Roman provincial governor.
Exactly. And the whole mindset seemed to be that Iraq was a tabula rasa, a blank slate, where American systems could just be imposed.
But they were totally cut off.
Largely, yes. Almost no one inside the Green Zone spoke Arabic. They were physically and culturally isolated from the country they were supposed to be governing. It's a classic imperial bubble scenario.
So let's talk about the end, the fall of Rome. The popular image is dramatic barbarians at the gates, empire collapsing overnight.
Right, like a movie. But the historians, they really lock horns over this. It wasn't like Carthage being destroyed or Berlin being bombed flat.
It was much slower, more uneven.
Much more. It was a long, messy transition, especially in the West. We use 476 AD when the last Western Roman emperor, little Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer as a convenient date.
But it wasn't like everyone woke up the next day and said, oh, the empire's gone.
Not at all. For most people, life continued pretty much as before. There wasn't some sudden societal collapse. Local Roman elites often stayed in charge. Roman law was still influential. Farming techniques didn't change overnight.
And the eastern half, Byzantium, just kept going for another 1,000 years.
Exactly. So fall is really a tricky word. It was too big, too embedded to just vanish completely. It morphed, it changed, it devolved in the West, but it didn't just, poof, disappear.
So if it wasn't a sudden fall, what was it? How do historians explain the transformation?
Well, the consensus generally points to a mix of internal and external factors. The source uses that great analogy from Agatha Christie.
Murder on the Orient Express.
Yeah, where it turns out all the suspects had a hand in it.
So, lots of contributing factors. Barbarian pressures were real, like the Huns pushing other groups towards the Roman frontiers.
Definitely a factor, but it wasn't just that they were pushed in, it was also how Rome handled them. Sometimes they were allowed to settle, but not fully integrated. They existed in this weird limbo.
Not quite Roman citizens, not quite independent barbarians.
Right, which made them harder to assimilate and easier to become destabilizing forces in Roman politics. Walter Goffard had that famous line.
The one about the imaginative experiment?
Yes. What we call the fall of the Western Roman Empire was an imaginative experiment that got a little out of hand. It captures that sense of unintended consequences, of things spiraling.
But even with that transformation, Rome's legacy is just immense.
Oh, undeniable. Its laws form the basis of many legal systems today. Its architecture, engineering, city planning, we still live with it, literally.
Towns and cities built by Romans are still lived in.
Absolutely. And the core idea, Rome represented creating some kind of unity across diverse peoples. That's been a goal, maybe the goal of geopolitics ever since. Even in its fall, its influence persisted.
Okay, so bringing it all together, we've seen these striking parallels.
Mm-hmm.
The ideals, the architecture, the military challenges, the privatization, the borders, the outsiders.
Yeah, the echoes are really strong.
And we've seen that Rome's fall wasn't a simple collapse, but this long, complex evolution. So what's the takeaway for us, for you listening?
Well, the sources suggest we can definitely learn from Rome. They point towards needing to fortify certain areas.
Like strengthening social safety nets.
Right, to combat inequality, build that sense of shared purpose,
Right.
and reinforcing the institutions that help assimilate newcomers rather than creating those limbo situations.
And there's a psychological point, too, isn't there? About being willing to adapt.
Yes, letting go of the need to keep everything exactly the same, especially when circumstances are demanding change. That seems crucial.
It's interesting, the source suggests Roman elites, particularly later on, became quite complacent, satisfied. Their motto might as well have been nihil potest ultra.
Hmm.
Nothing more is possible, we've reached the peak.
A dangerous mindset.
But America, it seems to have this built-in restlessness, doesn't it? This constant striving, this dissatisfaction with the status quo, even when things are good.
That's a really interesting contrast.
So maybe that's the provocative thought to leave you with, is that very restlessness, that inherent dissatisfaction that Rome perhaps lost. Could that actually be America's greatest strength as it navigates its own future? What does it truly mean for you or for the country to try and prevail at all costs in any undertaking in the centuries ahead?